Lent begins Wednesday, and as Chelsea and I were sharing about when she started ministry here, near to the time that my son-in-law started ministry at Bardstown Road Presbyterian Church, it seemed like that beginning of Lent in 2020, the beginning of the pandemic, would be such a short period of time that by the time Easter came, the pandemic would be a dim memory. And yet, here we are, 3 Lents later, still in the struggle and the grip and the world-changing circumstances, trying to understand what it means. The Transfiguration of the Lord commemorates a story that was written down long after Jesus went up on the mountain and was with his disciples, just after he had told them that he had come to understand that his work, his teaching, his preaching, his healing was going to end in his violent death. To me, this makes this story both more and less than a miracle story. Less because it's a miracle story, a vision story, an epiphany of God that takes place not in the midst of something beautiful and life-changing in a holy way, or a way that would seem holy to us, but rather because it is a story that takes place in the midst of loss and brokenness. More than a miracle story, because I believe that moments of transfiguration, although they are rare, and in these 2 Bible stories come with a lot of supernatural kind of backdrop, I believe that stories of transfiguration are for all of us a part of life when our life changes irradicably, when our life is transformed, whether by loss or death or by the blessing of a vision of something new that changes us forever. I think these moments come to any one of us when we are willing to put denial aside and lean into the fear and the shadows of which both of these stories speak. Lean into them, trusting that somehow God will be with us and we will be seen and known and become somehow more truly who we have been called to be. Lent coming up is a time for truth-telling. Truth-telling to ourselves, for trying to live authentically as a community in truth. And in the life of Jesus, it was a time where the church tells the stories that remind us that the cost of what Jesus came to do, the justice he preached, the love he demonstrated so radically, the cost of living and teaching that way was going to be his death. It was a time in which Jesus came to understand that the cost of his loving the world was losing himself. For Moses in Exodus, I think it was a moment in which he realized that any experience that truly transfigures us, whether it be a receiving of a word from God or a regular, more understandable but still catastrophic experience, changes us inevitably, and then instead sometimes of bringing that closer to the people we love, it puts a veil between us, separates us into a before and after. I see this on the faces I am seeing on TV, the faces of people who were ordinary Ukrainian citizens going about their lives, who now are clutching a purse, a small bag, and a child's hand as they walk toward the border with Poland. Transfiguration. I see this in the lives of so many people who, once they have leaned into a radical and drastic change, particularly those changes that they did not seek in their lives, find themselves out of sync and out of place, much like Moses, who found himself shining and needing to hide himself from those he loved the most, those he had come to lead. When I think about Moses' journey up the mountain to receive the law on the darkness and the horror and the thunder and the fire of Mount Sinai, and then his return below, I'm remembering a story that was shared with me by a young woman, actually probably 35-ish at this point, but a woman who was a young child in Jonesboro, Arkansas, many, many years ago in the early 90s, when a gunman who was a middle school student with her shot and killed numerous members of her class community. She was able, after the loss of her classmates, to go to a camp at Ferncliff Presbyterian Camp, which is in Arkansas, which had decided to hold healing camps for people, children, who had suffered gun violence and its after effects. She said this: "My name is Sarah. Although we have never met," she was writing this letter to us, to all of us really, anyone who ever gives to One Great Hour of Sharing. "Although we have never met, you changed my life. On March 24th, 1998, there was a shooting at my school similar to the one at Sandy Hook and Parkland. At that time, I was 11. I lost my best friend of 4 years that day. I can tell you now that if it hadn't been for this wonderful camp, the wonderful support we received from Ferncliff in the aftermath, many young lives also would have been lost in the aftermath. When you witness such cruelty in the world at such a young age, it is very easy to believe that pain and violence are the only things that are real. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for showing our community that love truly is stronger than hate. The memories of those camps are priceless to me. They help me see that something positive can come even out of something so horrific. It also shows me that God has a plan, even if we cannot see it sometimes through the chaos." She told me when I met her later that she ended up marrying a young man, another student, whom she met at the Ferncliff camp. And so her life was inevitably changed both in sorrow and in transformation personally, and in the joy of the life she then walked. The gospel story describes how Peter, James, and John went up on the mountain with Jesus, and they saw him there transfigured, glowing, with the two symbols of the Hebrew scriptures, Torah, the law, and the prophets, standing next to him and talking to him. What it doesn't tell you in the gospel story is that that transfiguration happened just a few days after Jesus told his followers that to be the Christ meant to give up his life, to lose it. Jesus, like Sarah, was transfigured because he had to confront the inevitability of his death and the horror of how that death would take place. When the moment of transfiguration came for Jesus, illuminating him with all the glory and the approval of God, it must have seemed to the disciples, I think, that what they had feared, that he was going to die, must have just been a bad dream, something they imagined. Because here surely was confirmation that God was protecting Jesus. Nothing bad could happen. "It's good that we're here," said Peter. "Let's build 3 dwellings. Let's stay here in this place of holiness and safety. and protection. But even as he spoke, the light faded, Elijah and Moses disappeared, and a cold shadow overpowered them. And the disciples, the story tells us, fell to their feet in the dirt, terrified. "This is my son," said the voice, understanding that the human condition is to walk through the valley of the shadow sometimes. "This is my son," the voice said. "Listen to him." How often in the midst of our hard times do we hope that it's just been a dream? Do we wish that we could be protected because we're believers? Do we, when we come to understand the true cost and the fear of what we're facing, keep our silence, veil our faces, and not talk about what's happened to us? "How are you doing?" "Oh, we're fine. We're fine. I'm fine. So fine." When really we're not fine. We're the farthest thing possible from fine. We're frightened. We're overwhelmed. We're anxious. We don't know what the next steps are. And we don't want to admit it. The songwriter and poet Leonard Cohen wrote a song called Anthem, and it contains these lines: "Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. It's how light gets in." Leonard Cohen was Jewish, and I believe these images in the song he wrote came from his experience and training in Jewish mysticism from the book of Zohar, the Kabbalah, which is a medieval expression of Judaism and has in it a creation story very different from the one we know. In that creation story, God's desire was to spill holy light into the world, to flood the world with radiance. And so God devised a series of 10 clay vessels through which the light of the divine presence would drop and flow and overflow until at last it came gently to the earth. But the light of God, the story tells us, was so overwhelming and so powerful that it shattered the clay vessels and trapped the light in so many millions of shards of broken clay, which clattered to the ground and became the human community. The work of the human community, teaches this story, is to understand that we are broken people with holy light in us, and that our work is to bring our brokenness together, letting the light shine through, so that once when all is again whole, Tikkun Olam, the healing of the world, can take place, and the kingdom will come. Some of you may be aware that both up in Louisville with Kentucky Refugee Ministries and over in Owensboro with Catholic Charities, a long, hard work has been happening since last fall to resettle as many Afghans as could flee the country. A moment that now feels so much more powerful and overwhelming as we watch on television the people fleeing Ukraine and know that our very hard refugee crisis in this universe is about to become even more overwhelming. In Owensboro, Catholic Charities and their caseworkers had been meeting with the Afghan individuals and families and trying to find placements for them, apartments where they could live. And there were about 300 families in the first rush that came to Owensboro, but only 150 of them were able to be placed in homes because there was a housing shortage in the area, and also because some landlords were uncomfortable renting to newcomers and avoided them. By about the middle of December, 150 of those refugees were still in a hotel in Owensboro and were waiting their turn for an appointment and a chance at jobs and apartments. And then the tornadoes came on December 10th, wiping out most of downtown Mayfield, parts of Bowling Green, Dawson Springs, so many other communities just up and down and around the road from us. So the lead caseworker, her name is Susan Montalvo, went to the hotel and asked to speak to one of the leaders of the Afghan community there, whose name is Kaibar. She said, "I'm so sorry, we're going to have to postpone the rest of the meetings for housing because this crisis, this catastrophe, is overwhelming our capacity. There are just not enough caseworkers and enough shelter to go around. And I'm asking you to please apologize and tell your neighbors that we will get back to you as soon as we can." It seemed like so often seems in our world that when crisis happens, there's a response of scarcity rather than a response of generosity. And even though Susan Montalvo wanted to help, it just seemed that there was not enough. And then she said, after saying this to Kaibar, his response completely floored me. He said, "Mrs. Susan, I led a team for the International Red Cross in Afghanistan and in Yemen. I've led teams responding to landslides, earthquakes, and floods. Give me a vest and put me to work. I can help. A lot of us can help." She said, "The Afghan refugees have gone through hell, and yet in that experience, they were transfigured. They did not see what separated them. They saw what brought them together, which was an experience of loss in which grace and transformation were being sought." These moments of grace and change are not meant to be a great escape from our suffering. They are meant to confirm that if we are faithful in our times of suffering, if we speak the truth to ourselves and to other people in love, if we lean into our lament and our loss and our sorrow, even if we lean into our questions and our rage at God and at the world, that we will be changed and ultimately changed for the better. Transfiguration is not meant to be an escape, but rather a waking up to God, so that we become more of who we truly are, and in doing so, let the light shine through the cracks. A few years ago, I had the privilege of going to the Middle East. Part of my regular job is to work with the Presbyterian Church in Lebanon and Syria, and because of the war there since 2012, I have had to go there many times and be with our colleagues there. One of the times I went, they decided to hold a retreat at the Near East School of Theology, the Presbyterian Seminary in Beirut, and to invite to that retreat about 50 pastors. They came from Armenia, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq. And they were there to talk about how pastoring and being the church had changed in the face of an ongoing war. One of the things that we did there was to study the Psalms. And one of the pieces that I was allowed to lead was a psalm reflection on Psalm 137, the one that begins, "By the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept. There we hung up our lyres, weeping, saying, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion,' and we could not sing." It's also the psalm that ends, "Blessed are those who take up the babies of our enemies and dash them against the stones, a part that often is dropped off when we read this publicly in worship, but a part that, to me, feels very true to the human experience: longing, sorrow, love, rage. We read the psalm out loud in Arabic and in English, and then I asked them if they would be willing to share what they had noticed in the psalm, what they felt in their bodies as they listened to it. And there was a very heavy silence at first, and then one by one, these pastors began to share their grief and their confusion about how they had always believed that those who followed God would never have anything terrible happen to them, and how their parishioners demanded that they explain to them why they were suffering, why they had lost a spouse, a child, a home, a city. They talked about how the songs and the prayers of their church members had fallen silent in this impossibly difficult time that was not ending. And you could see on their faces the weariness and the sorrow and the grief. When they finished speaking, I was about to close, and I was trying to think of what I could possibly say in a word of prayer, and had about decided that silence was going to be my only refuge. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw, in the place where the Iraqis were, that the wife of the pastor of the church in Kirkuk, the Presbyterian church, one of 3 in Iraq, was standing up to speak. And in her face was not the weariness and the sorrow and the rage and overwhelm of all of the pastors in the room. In her face, there was peace. And she said, "Dr. Laurie, I would like to share what I saw in this psalm. I saw hope." And everyone in the room kind of looked, and I asked her if she could share where the hope was in the psalm that we had read. She said, "They hung up their harps on the willows there. They could have cast them down," she went on. "They could have broken those harps over their knees and dashed them to the ground. But they hung them up. This shows us that they hoped for a better future," she said. "They believed they would have a future," she said. "Though now was not the time for singing. The time for singing would come." Let us pray. It's in every one of us to be wise. Warm your hearts, open up both your eyes. We can all know everything without ever asking why. It's in every one of us, by and by. It's in every one of us, by